Well, thank you very much for coming along to this Open Access Week event, which I think has got the title, What Lies Ahead? So we're going to be kind of looking over the horizon for the next hour and a half. Open access is it's a big and complicated subject, but I suppose there are two ways of looking at it. One is to look at open access as an instrumental challenge, an organisational challenge. There are new requirements by funders, by research councils, by HEFCE and so on about making freely available the fruits of our research labours, and that conjures up a whole set of regulations and processes that we need to get our head around. And of course, emerging out of that is the ability, when material is open access, to track its use in a way that we haven't been able to before. So the issue of metrics is intimately connected with open access as a means of maybe tracking the circulation of our research, the impact of our research, and speculatively as an alternative to something that we've become used to, the peer review by experts of our research. So there's that instrumental aspect to open access, but there's also a kind of broader philosophical, ethical aspect to it, which is more organic, I suppose. An organic desire to actually make our work open access because it might reach more people, and that's what we want to do, and that maybe for publicly funded work it might be the right thing to do in a much broader way. Whichever of those we look at, it's got clear implications for researchers and for the managers of research. So it seems appropriate on what I gather is World Statistics Day to try and weave between these two aspects of open access today with the two speakers that we've got. And we have Professor James Wilsdon, who is Professor of Science and Democracy here at the University of Sussex. And in 2014 to 2015, James chaired a review of metrics for the Higher Education Funding Council and published a report in July this year, The Metric Tide, is that the right title? Which, and I don't want to kind of steal your thunder, but if I've understood it correctly, the gist of that is that metrics might support but not supplant expert judgment. And there was a moment, I think, when we thought that metrics were kind of fading away and had been dealt with. But I think you wrote a piece in The Guardian recently based on some leaks that were coming out of the government, suggesting by implication that metrics might actually start to come back again.
Yes, I'll
okay, you can talk a bit about that. So James is going to be talking about how we might use metrics to move to a more open and accountable research system. We also have James Baker, who is lecturer in digital humanities, based in the Department of History and the Sussex Humanities Lab. James is relatively new to Sussex and comes to us from the British Library, where he was a digital curator. He's got an interest in lots of things, but perhaps especially satirical art of the 18th century. James convenes the Institute of Historical Research Digital History Seminar in London and is a skilled practitioner of applying software to history. James is going to talk about how open access, which we tend to think so far as being something to do with journals, might start to impact authors of scholarly monographs. Okay. So the format is, I think, that James Baker is going to talk first, and then the other James, and then we have time for a discussion and questions and answers afterwards. We've got the room booked until 2, but I'm not necessarily planning to kind of fill all the time till 2. So we're actually going to aim maybe to finish no later than 1:45 if we stay on schedule. That means you can get to other places by 2, if that's causing any anxiety. Okay. Thank you.
I'm told I can stand over here. Okay, so it's a real pleasure to speak on Open Access Week, and to know that Open Access Week is now in its 8th year. From my perspective, it feels like we've come a hell of a long way since the Budapest Open Access Initiative statement, which was in 2002, is that right? Yes. And when I, as an undergraduate then, probably wouldn't have cared less about this open access thing. And I'm not going to talk about it at all, but it is interesting perhaps to think about that relationship between open access and those sort of putative consumers of open access documents, one of which, of course, being our students being able to find those documents more easily. We'll talk about that at length, but it kind of made me reflect a little bit on that when I was thinking that that initiative sort of started way back when I was an undergraduate. I've got quite a history with open access. I once worked as a repository coordinator at the University Library in that classic postdoctoral wilderness when you weren't quite sure what to do. And part of my job was to both work on the open access repository and get it ready for the ref, but also to act as an open access advocate within the scholarly community at the University of Kent. As also mentioned, I also worked at the British Library, and I worked at the British Library at a time when it went from being a place that didn't really talk in public about open access to a place that gradually started to embrace the notion in public that it wanted scholarly publications to be available to the public, to a global audience in some form that was free at point of access. And that was an interesting transition to observe, both externally with people saying, kind of like, why didn't the British Library talk about this thing? But also internally to observe how the library went about formulating its position in that way. I've also had the privilege of editing 2 guides to open access monograph publishing in the last couple of years. Both were produced as part of the Open project, OAPEN UK project, I don't quite know how to pronounce it, which is a collaborative research project that ran until this summer, I believe actually, that gathered evidence to help stakeholders make really informed decisions on the future of open access scholarly monographs, particularly in the humanities and social sciences. The project was joint funded by the HRC and by GISC, and it contributed to the Open Library, which some of you may have come across, which is a library of just over 3,000 scholarly monographs, many of which now considered beyond their saleable value. In short, I guess we would know this, that academic monographs tend to be sold once to all the libraries, and then there's little economic value to them after that. And then made open access by the academic presses. So presses such as Leiden, Manchester University Press got involved, made some of their not that back catalogue available open access through this one library of resources. I don't know exactly the metrics on its use, but it's been relatively successful in the period in which it's been open. And it's based on a Dutch model as well, doing similar projects. So I'm kind of going to talk today on this open access monograph publishing for arts and social sciences is the second guide that I edited. I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those guides today. And I'm not going to run you through kind of the nuts and bolts, what chapter said what kind of thing, but try and tease out some of the themes which perhaps come out of the guides which aren't there on the contents page, which aren't the things we perhaps explicitly are saying, but we were implicitly thinking as authors and editors when putting this stuff out towards the research communities. So the first guide was published in 2013, and it was specifically a guide to Creative Commons for humanities and social science monograph authors. It was published in the wake of the Finch report, and the wave of perhaps somewhat related debates that ensued in humanities and social sciences about open access, Creative Commons, and its viability within those disciplines. And the monograph always seemed to be the one that came up as kind of like, well, what are we going to do about monographs? How are we going to deal with monographs in this kind of Finchy open access landscape? The Finch report, if you recall, paved the way both for open access mandates we have today and the mechanisms by which those mandates would be fulfilled. We were interested in the former, and as a consequence, the design was published with the aim to be a guide to Creative Commons for HSS authors. It was organised around monograph publication, I guess partly because of this kind of worry thing, and not because we or the Open UK project saw open access monographs as like an impending government imposition. And it clearly wasn't something that's going to happen, and indeed we were right on that. It hasn't become something as of yet that's coming down through policy. But rather as monographs were through a lens through which to think about first humanities social sciences arguing for special treatment. Clearly was one of the lenses by which special treatment was being argued with the monograph. And secondly, because monographs raise a huge amount of complex issues with publication that perhaps you don't get in a journal landscape. Things like third-party rights are more acute in a monograph landscape. Things like the length of gestation of a project in relation to funding is more acute compared to a journal article. And issues of international publication and republication are kind of more complex when you move a monograph into that space. You may, if you've got eagle eyes and can see from the back, see that there was a number of authors on this. And probably all of those authors can be classified in some degree as being on the side of the OA cause. Martin Eve, who of course co-founded and recently launched the Open Library of Humanities, which I'm delighted that Sussex is signatory towards, is contributing to. Ernesto Prego, who is a pioneer of open access journal publication, he runs a publication called Comics Grid. That's why I know Ernesto originally through my interest in comics and caricature, and latterly through our sort of our interest in open access. And Graham Stone works at Huddersfield as a repository coordinator manager. I think Huddersfield, if I'm right, kind of pushed ahead quite early with academic repositories and trying to get scholars within their departments to contribute to them. The other two authors on Sir Graham were Ellen Collins and Karen Malloy, both of whom have been instrumental in running the Open Project. Karen as head of collections, I think, at GISC. I can't remember the exact job title. But nevertheless, important figures within that kind of infrastructure side, GISC side of open access in the UK. Now, we all came from an open access, sort of positive open access background, and we were very aware of that when we were first constructing this particular guide. So we were very careful throughout not to preach. Rather, what we tried to do was aim through myth-busting, and the guide took kind of a form of a question-answer format for large sections. How Creative Commons licenses would fit the purpose to enable a step change in scholarly communications. Something that, of course, the digital transformations in society and culture taking place all around us has made eminently possible. Like the web, the book is just a technology. I know that may be a controversial thing to say in a library, but it is just a technology. So this was this particular guide, which I'm not going to linger on for too long, but it's just to say it's one of the contexts within which the data guide was written. Since then, Martin Eve, of course, I mentioned Open Library Humanities, of course, has published Open Access Humanities, Context, Controversies and Future. And this is another context within which our guide must be situated. I won't go into his argument in too much detail here, but suffice to say that he's very much pro-open access, if not the UK implementation of open access. He stresses the clear legal benefits of open access to existing and desired academic practice. So, for example, open access could potentially help us overcome legal headaches around translation of works, legal headaches around sustained critique, and of course things like content mining as well from the more technology side. And crucially, Martin makes a really strong case in favour, among other things, of the folly of using prestige as a proxy for quality. The economic models for publishing do not have to look like the publishing industry. That systems that value labour should be considered important here. That we should reassess the value of when we ascribe, the values of what we ascribe to well-known journals. That we need to get out of this supply-side economy trap, as he calls it. And a really key point, I think, as well in here that he makes is about reviving the role of the editor through special issues arranged around post-publication. In short, kind of taking back the responsibility of scholars for how we communicate is one of his main messages. And I'm not plugging his book, it is open access, thankfully. But the reason I mention it is because it appeared before the guide appeared. And so it's another context within which this guide was published and was being written, I guess, as well. So the guide itself, relatively slim. I have 5 copies. If anyone wants to take one, I should probably give one to the library, I guess. But 5 free copies if anyone thinks they really want one. And you can order your own as well from GISC website. Was a guide to open access monograph publishing. So again, focusing on monographs, again, focusing on the arts, humanities, social science researchers. And the sort of statement below was that it was about helping researchers to understand the opportunities and challenges of publishing a scholarly monograph in open access. It was published this summer. It was authored by the same team. It was edited by the same team. as the Creative Commons Guide. A team that, nevertheless, by association with Martin, were perhaps placed in a much more clearly pro-OA camp than we were when we published the previous guide. Nevertheless, the guide was still conceived and delivered with impartiality in mind throughout. The guide is divided into two main parts. The first covers open access monographs and business models for open access monographs, and tries to lead scholars through the different environments that are out there by which you can publish a monograph today in open access form, some of which involve stumping money up front, some of which involve things like OLH style models where people are buying in to a community of cash, in essence, to enable monographs to be published. And some are more about kind of unlocking monographs later to make them available after they've initially been published. And the second half covers common concerns about open access monograph publishing. Now, these weren't sort of common concerns that we just imagined ourselves and thought, let's think of all the common concerns that people have said to us and kind of in an anecdotal form. Rather, this came directly out of the Open Project. So all the surveys, the research, and the events that they'd held during the life of their project were feeding out of that into this guide in terms of the sorts of things they'd heard and the ways in which they tried to respond to some of the concerns of the community, or indeed hadn't felt they responded appropriately or as full as they'd like to, so we were trying to kind of codify that within this document. As at the beginning, rather than going through the guide page by page, I really wanted to pick out some highlights, I guess. Some cross-cutting themes, because that's probably more interesting to our discussions as well. And some things that I really believed have been important, that were kind of more subtle messages that were coming through from the guide. So the first is one that I was talking to someone outside about, which is, whilst it's easy to get fixated on greed and gold, on these delivery models, the monograph market is much more complex, was one of the messages we were trying to get across. Just to sort of define some terms, gold open access, of course, gives the reader access to a final published copy of the work immediately upon publication. It actually has nothing to do with money, which is a very unfortunate thing that happened where gold got associated with money because UK government policy started talking about money in relationship to gold open access, but it's got nothing to do with money. And green gives the reader a free version of the work to access, which has been self-archived, usually by the author. In some cases, I know some institutions ask or take that responsibility from the authors, and they do it at institutional level, but primarily it's authors themselves depositing a preprint or a postprint of their works. We could dispute the virtues of each of these until the cows come home, and I'm sure in other venues during Open Access Week people are, but I'm not really interested in that, and neither was the guide. What it does instead is to demonstrate the messiness of real-world implementation and makes a case for consideration of what is out there. Does, for example, paying a lot of money to a publisher to recoup their costs of producing a book really solve the problem we're trying to address, which is changing scholarly communication? And it also tries to outline there are, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, various models that are emerging to compete with the scholarly press side idea of what a publication is, in terms of it costs this much money up front to make, therefore need to recoup it in some way. Open access presses that relieve the costs of faculty by being set up within universities. UCL recently re-established University Press, UCL Press, sorry, that was. Freemium models where you can kind of get a basic version of something, but a nicer, more hyperlinked version is sold for profit in some form. Delayed open access. So open access only after publishers have made enough money from university libraries, which perhaps isn't an ideal situation either, if one of the purposes of open access kind of solve some of that crisis. And collaborative underwriting, such as things like Open Library Humanities. The guide tries to suggest that all these things really need some space to breathe, some space to mature, to consider, to be evaluated, and that probably from these a form will emerge that scholars will latch onto, but right now we perhaps can't, we shouldn't be sort of pinning down on one particular way of approaching it. The second big theme is that the benefits of open access tend to lie in the unexpected. This really addresses the kind of why bother question that sits behind many concerns about open access. People saying that, well, I could make it available open access, but no one's going to read it apart from the people who'd read it anyway. It's just going to change the dynamics and cause me hassle. which is a question that does come up quite a lot. That open access won't really mean much in reality. It won't change readerships. By stressing the benefits of the no price barrier and no restricted copyright, the guide takes as a starting point that although academics write for an audience, we all write for audiences all the time. Humanists have argued that sometimes that spatial, temporal and cultural circumstances by which people write mean that a work can never be received as it's intended. This is a kind of, when I look at text and people are talking about their own readerships, I kind of say, okay, they think they've got a readership, right? But I also know that there are other readerships out there that they wouldn't know of due to temporal spatial circumstances. This still applies as scholarly monograph publishing and scholarly publishing. Open access places the text of a work into a commons that reaches beyond academic spheres, beyond economic advantage, and beyond human-only interactions, into a new domain of perception. This is where the monographs that can enter a domain, of course, of being read by machines, because they have open licenses which machines can read. The other main theme is that humanities, social science monograph writers don't have to do anything now, as of this summer. But that doesn't mean it isn't worth caring. As you'll all know, there's nothing within current policy that states that people have to publish their monographs open access. However, Catherine Fitzpatrick, I thought I had a quote there, sorry. Catherine Fitzpatrick famously argued that the academic book is dead, but it's undead. She writes in Planned Obsolescence, it's thus important for us to consider the work that the book isn't doing for us, the ways that it remains vital and vibrant, the ways that it's become undead, haunting the living from beyond the grave. And her argument in Planned Obsolescence is very much about this idea that just because we don't have to do anything doesn't mean we should actually not reflect on our practice and reflect on what we're doing. The guide makes it very clear that monograph authors don't need to do anything right now. And this remains the case still from when we were originally writing and editing. But we also hope that just because it's not mandated that we can't help in some form by talking about monographs within the space of open access. By the very act of writing a guide about open access monographs, a thing that exists but nevertheless seems somehow at odds with itself, an open access monograph, kind of a physical book, we think of as a monograph, but you can't make a physical book open access, right? So it kind of exists in its own kind of self-contradiction. What we're kind of doing, I think, is taking undead, as Catherine Fitzpatrick would call it, print form, forced into a digital container that puts things we associate with the digital, so with the exception of unlimited reproduction and instant distribution, into some kind of straitjacket. So we're trying to kind of, by placing the monograph in the space of open access, we're trying to really help people think a little bit about what it is that you're doing when you write a monograph and think about open access. What it is you're restraining about that you could be doing differently because the digital allows you to do so much more than the monograph could. And what we're really doing is then to hope to provoke some monograph authors to consider what it is they're trying to achieve in writing their own monographs, and whether the monograph is indeed the best possible venue their argument could take. Now, full disclosure here, I'm an early career historian, I'm an early career researcher. I believe that the present academic culture to some extent demands from me at some level that I write a book. And so I'm currently writing a book, and it's going to be published by a university, well not university press, it's going to be published by an academic press, and probably won't be open access because I can't afford the money up front. I don't really want to pay them either. I'm not doing it because I think it's the best way of communicating my research. I have other venues for that. And so we're kind of, what we're trying to say here is that we're trying to provoke people a little bit, particularly perhaps mid or late career people, to think about what it is they're doing with monographs, because of what it imposes further down the chain in terms of how researchers at the bottom end therefore are kind of feeling obliged to publish monographs when perhaps isn't the best way of getting this stuff out. The final main point it makes touches on Martin's book, actually. It's about quality and prestige. A common concern the Open Project found from its participants was that open access publishers aren't as good in terms of quality than their commercial counterparts. It's something they heard again and again and again. The guide is quite clear here, although some OA publishers are new, that the issues here are exactly the same with traditional publishing as with an online publisher. We just have to use our common sense when we work with publishers. Some traditional publishers have poor practices, and I'm sure we've all heard horror stories of people working with publishers of all ilks, where they've kind of come across practice where you think, well, maybe that's the point we should have got out of that relationship. So if the peer review, the interaction with the commissioning editor, or the professionalism of a OA publisher doesn't feel right, then just don't proceed, is what we say here. But the same applies with any other type of publication. It's not something that's specific to open access publication. The other thing we talked about a little bit was about prestige and scholarly presses. The guide only touches on this a little bit. But I think it's important to stress that Martin does at length in his book that quality and prestige are not the same thing. These two things are not exactly the same. Prestige is constructed. My experience is that open access publishers are just as if not more concerned with quality because they know rightly or wrongly that mistakes they make could be used negatively against them to infer on their prestige. And rarely so when they get things really right as an OA publisher, do people say, ooh, that's a sign of quality. They just say, well, that's what you should be doing, that's what publishers do. So it's always important to realise that these two things are slightly different. It's one of the themes we try and get through. Okay, so the stated aim of this guide is to help researchers to understand the opportunities and challenges of publishing a scholarly monograph in an open access form. We believe it does that, and we certainly hope that you'd recommend it to colleagues as a reference point where they're interested in pursuing that with their own monograph works. If indeed, accepting the fact, of course, this is going to be something that dates, it's not going to last forever, this guide. It may only sort of depend on how our regulatory system changes. It may well be it will last a year or two in terms of its current form and what it can offer. But I also hope that you'll find some of the subtle arguments that I think I've teased out from it are a further reason to recommend it even beyond its own usable lifetime as a guide. And perhaps we can discuss, after James has spoken as well, perhaps we can discuss some of those arguments later this afternoon. So, thank you.
So I'm going to hand straight over to James, unless there's, and we'll have a discussion afterwards, unless there's an instant response of someone who cannot wait another 25 minutes to say something, to denounce everything they've heard for the last 20 minutes. Or, no, right. Thank you.
Great. Let me just... Excellent. Well, thanks, David, and thanks, James, for a very interesting talk. I hope what I'll say will complement James's remarks quite well, particularly some of these thoughts that he's been outlining around more fundamental changes in the infrastructure for scholarly communications. Like James, I'm a long-time advocate for open access in both scholarly and non-scholarly settings. I spent several years working in public policy at a large part of the last decade at the think tank Demos, and back in 2003 we were the first think tank to go completely OA with all of our reports. Everything was released in a way that now seems normal from policy operations, but back then was still quite a sort of radical thing to do. And these days I've got links with Martin and the Open Library of Humanities, with PLOS, and I've just recently taken up a role with Palgrave Communications, which is this new social science, primarily some humanities, OA journal that Palgrave Nature Group have launched. So I'm a big supporter of OA, and I try and publish my own stuff in open formats. But I think all of us who've been involved in the open access debate, in whatever way, for however long, are conscious that in many respects it's a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. And a lot of these more fundamental questions that James has just raised, and which Martin Eve raises very well in his book, are very difficult for us as a community, as a sector, to tackle. issues of how we reward and recognise quality, issues of prestige, how we kind of marry up gradual shifts in the sort of economic market structure of scholarly communication with imperatives from policy and elsewhere to try and move in this direction more quickly. And so as we think about that sort of broader landscape, metrics, I think, are a very important part of the debate as well. It's through metrics, increasingly, that we do recognise and reward quality and prestige. Metrics can be very helpful, as I'll say in a minute. They can also be a huge impediment to progress in this area. The stranglehold that things like journal impact factors have on scholarly publishing, scholarly communication more generally, can make progress very, very difficult, whether towards more OA formats or towards shaking up publishing in a number of different ways. So I think metrics are important, and in a way it's through bringing together advances in the OA debate, the OA landscape, shifts in debates around metrics and data infrastructure for research, and other shifts in the broader policy climate, that we will see real progress being made towards that more open, accountable, transparent way of doing research that I'm sure many of us in this room would wish to see. So I'm going to say a bit about the metrics review, which was a specific task set by government, which I and a group of colleagues completed over the last year, and which published, as David said in his introduction, a report in July. In fact, we published 3 reports. The main one in blue, which was the main report, the metrics review. We also published a long, perhaps too long, 200-page literature review, which will tell you everything you ever wanted to know, a lot more, I think, on all aspects of metrics in research. And then the third document was an attempt to look at the outcomes of the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, in 2014, and to explore the degree of correlation between the outcomes of that exercise, which was conducted primarily, as we're all probably aware, through peer-review panels, to look at correlation between that and what would have been the case had we gone down a more metric-based path. This, as I'll come back to at the end, is an issue that sort of will be rearing its head again in the next few weeks as the spending review reaches its conclusion. So we put out a lot of material. All of this, needless to say, is open access. And there's loads online if you want to have a look at any of it. The review was set up at the instigation originally of David Willetts when he was still Minister. He was very interested. Obviously, Willetts is a key figure as well in the progress we've seen here in the UK system towards embedding OA in various policy debates. And he was similarly enthusiastic about the potential to shake up the world of measurement in research, so initiated this review. It was conducted with the institutional support of HEFCE, and I had a steering group that I won't run through there, but you'll see a sort of mix of different disciplines, national academies, the editor of Nature, etc., etc. A really good, broad group, all of whom were really engaged in this task, because it was a really good process. Everyone was very committed to trying to produce the best result we could. Our approach was, as well as having that diverse group, to have a broad set of terms of reference to try and open up some of these deeper questions about scholarly communication and the infrastructure that surrounds it, to make the whole process as open and transparent as possible. We had various calls for evidence. We had lots of workshops, including a big one here at Sussex that some of you, I expect, attended in October of 2014. Lots of discussion on social media, etc., etc. So it was quite a sort of big undertaking. And these were some of the responses that it generated, some of the sort of online discussion, blogs and elsewhere. As you can imagine, we had a lot of engagement in this from the big publishers, and you see there Elsevier's response, perhaps unsurprisingly, pro greater use of metrics in the management of the research system. Below that was a joint letter initiated in part by an academic here at Sussex, but with a whole group of colleagues criticising moves in this direction from a fundamental philosophical perspective, and they ended up with over 200 signatories. At the top there, you've got a response from David Colquhoun, who's now emeritus professor of pharmacology at UCL and a very active crusader online against various forms of pseudoscience, and he sees metrics up there with homeopathy and witchcraft as three of the great evils confronting the modern age. And then you had responses from bodies like plots, which again, characteristically, were more nuanced and balanced in terms of discussing positive and negative uses of metrics. It's not metrics per se that are a problem, but it's how they're very often embedded and used. So lots of debate. And I mean, the context of the review was, in part, the REF and an ongoing debate about where the REF goes next. And this, of course, again, is very hot right now with debates about the future organisation of the funding system. But there have been periodic calls for a simplification of the REF, and some would say that the best way of getting to that simplified goal is by using metrics instead of peer review. But as I'll say in a minute, there are problems involved in that as well, particularly, should be said, in the humanities and social sciences. In addition to the use of metrics in research management exercises like the REF, we're all, of course, aware, not least because Sussex tells us weekly in its our weekly Friday update on where the university is coming in these things. We seem to be doing very well at the moment in various league tables and sort of rising back up again after several years where we've been dropping. But of course the pervasive power of rankings and league tables in our sector is something that has crept up on a lot of us, unexpected, very little debate has really taken place about the extent to which rankings and league tables have come to exert all sorts of influence over the sector, influencing student choice, parental pressure on student choice, and all sorts of other things. So that's another big area in which metrics of a rather different kind play an increasingly significant role. We've also, of course, seen the rise of altmetrics, and I remember being here in the library a year or so ago having a session on some of the altmetric possibilities that were emerging. Of course, a very exciting field, very dynamic field, lots of new players, and they bring into the measurement game a whole set of factors that aren't captured by conventional quality metrics, i.e. citations. And that's exciting. It introduces lots of opportunities in a number of ways, as I'll say in a minute. At the same time, we've seen a sort of backlash against inappropriate uses of measurement and indicators in the system from a number of directions in the last few years. The San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment was one high-profile critique of particularly the use of the journal impact factor, which came out 3 years ago now, and Sussex, interestingly, was the first UK university to sign up to DORA, and I think it's still only one of 3 UK universities that's a signatory to that declaration. Of course, as we experience the kind of power of metrics and things like journal impact factors in our community, in our sector, is very, very strong. And this is one example I used at the launch of the Metric Tide report, in part to embarrass Phil Campbell, the editor of Nature, who was there on the panel with me. But the same week that the report came out, I did a commentary in Nature. And if anyone logged on to read that commentary, the first thing you got was this enormous pop-up box, which actually obscures the title of the piece, which is that we need a measured approach to metrics. And this is also popping up with Nature's impact factor of 41.456. One wonders what the difference is between an impact factor of 41.456 and 41.457, which is partly the absurdity of GIFs. But anyway, that's just an example of the problem. So in the report, what do we say? I'll try and speed up, I don't want to spend too long on this. We say that across the community that we're part of, the way we think, we talk, we argue about metrics remains highly contested. There's a lot of misunderstanding out there about metrics, their potential and their pitfalls. And this is another good example recently to try and explore some of these debates. Again, a paper in Nature called the Leiden Manifesto for Research Metrics. Our view as a review group was that peer review, for all its flaws, and we again all are very aware of the limitations of peer review, continues to be the least worst form of academic governance we have, and in that sense continues, as we experienced it and heard from the community as we consulted for the review, continues to enjoy widespread support. So our feeling was that metrics should support, not supplant, expert judgment in the management of the research system. At the same time, as I've been saying already, we all again know how inappropriate indicators or inappropriate uses of indicators can create perverse incentives in the research system. Not only journal impact factors, grant income targets, as I'm looking over here at the research office, which fortunately we don't impose in that way here in Sussex, but just this last week, Queen's University Belfast in position of big new stretch targets on all of its academics to raise grant income at a time when public funding, at least for research, is of course flat and likely to decline further. So it's interesting use of indicators. And of course also lots of concerns about the use of indicators in the career structure in various ways. Panels for promotion, recruitment, the way in which we're all judged and assessed as academics in our journey through academia. And here's a key point where it does link up with the open access debate. Indicators, good or ill, can only meet their potential if they're underpinned by an open and interoperable data infrastructure. And there's lots in our report about how you get that data infrastructure right. The key importance of, we've already heard a bit about this, wider use of digital identifiers, DOI numbers, wider uptake of ORCID identifiers for individual researchers, and the various other bits of the plumbing, if you like, for an open, interoperable research data system, which is crucial, important for open access, but important more broadly as well for how we move forward with scholarly communication. On the ref, I won't go into huge detail, but suffice to say we did this very detailed correlation analysis. We went right down to the level of individual outputs. There were 191,000 or so individual outputs that went into the ref from across all universities, all different subject panels. And we were able to explore correlations across 150,000 of those. The reason we couldn't do the other 40,000 were that they didn't have DOIs, they couldn't be measured, and that's part of the problem with a hasty move to a metric-based research assessment system. You would lose a whole tranche of stuff that was currently being counted, and most of that would be in the humanities and some of the social sciences. So that's one problem. Similarly, on the impact side of the ref, most of you will be familiar with the way the ref's structured, 65% for output, 20% for impact, 50% for environment. Within the impact bit, it's also not feasible to replace what we had in 2014 in the form of impact case studies, narrative-based, primarily qualitative accounts of impact, to replace those with a move to impact. That's not to say that you can't use particularly alternative metrics in various interesting ways to capture non-scholarly, non-traditional impacts. You can, but those indicators are still relatively immature in their application, and it would be quite risky from a funding perspective to link those to the funding system. And bearing in mind that through the ref you're allocating around £10 billion over a cycle of public money, you have to be pretty confident in the robustness of the indicators that you incorporate, particularly because otherwise you unleash whole new dynamics of gaming and misbehaviour in response to those metrics. There's a need for more research on all this stuff, or we would, actually it wasn't me saying that from Spree, it was my colleagues from the STEM community. But, so, to sort of get to what we said in conclusion, we said there should be responsible metrics. So metrics aren't bad per se, it's all about how we use them. Responsible metrics need to be understood in terms of their robustness, the degree of humility that we display in using them, recognising, as I say, that they should support but not supplant other forms of expert assessment. The need for transparency, and again this of course buffers up against the OA debate in terms of keeping data collection, data analysis processes open and transparent, making sure that those who are being evaluated can question, can test, can verify the indicators that are being used and the results that they generate. Diversity, also very important, diversity across different fields and disciplines, but also a diversity of plurality of researcher career paths. We don't want to create a model of, and this again links to one of the points James was making, a sort of model of academic career progression that pushes people down one narrow path, when we all recognise that there are a diversity of paths. And you have this contradiction now where many of the people who've sort of risen up towards the top of the system would never have got there had these same measurement system's been applied at the earlier stage of their career. It certainly applies to me. And yet we are, by intention or accident, applying criteria to those earlier career researchers coming up that can be quite damaging in terms of that diversity. Recommendations I will just whiz through. There needs to be a more sophisticated approach. We felt HEI leaders have a really key role here. Too many universities are basically outsourcing the task of strategic planning and priority setting to the rankers, to exercises like the REF, and they're not thinking through enough in their own institutional context what does and doesn't matter, the particular distinctive missions they have, and the role of indicators within the management systems that they develop. We think research managers and administrators, and to this you can of course add librarians and others who work in information management across universities, really, really key community of people to help advance and spread this idea of responsible use of metrics through the system. Far too often I think we end up in a very false and unhelpful tension between the academics and research managers, others in roles in universities that are non-academic, being seen as advancing metrics, while the academics are seen to resist them, and we need to try and break through that and get to this more constructive co-design of the system that we all want. Ditto HR managers, recruitment panels, absolutely key. Individual researchers as well. I mean, we all can think of individuals who send us emails with the H index, their own H index in their email signature. That kind of stuff needs to be ridiculed publicly for the nonsense that it is. Funders need to do more. I'm just speeding up because I don't want to take too long. Data providers, similarly. Publishers, of course. We have some publishers here in the room, but we've seen the more progressive publishers moving away from a sole focus on the journal impact factor as the way they talk about the prestige of their journal, towards a more rounded, more balanced set of indicators. That's still in its early days. There's still great pressure, as you saw from my Nature pop-up box example, to fall back on a sort of unitary, simple measurement, however flawed and imperfect that is. And we need to encourage publishers to move towards this more rounded, richer view of quality and performance. A need for greater transparency and openness in research data infrastructure links very closely with the open access agenda, and it's going, as I say, beyond just the publishing system towards thinking about the back end of scholarly infrastructure. And there's some great work that people like Cameron Nayland and Greg Builder and others have done on all these sort of questions about scholarly infrastructure that influenced us a lot in the review. On ORCID identifiers, we, as a review, felt that they were particularly important, and we've seen a lot of movement towards greater uptake of ORCID. We felt certainly that ORCID should be made mandatory in the next REF as one further step, a bit like the way that OA has been taken up by Hefty and incorporated into thinking about the next REF. DOIs as well. I mean, there's a sort of something maybe Jane could discuss this a bit. The sort of extent to which it's easy to extend DOIs across everything. I know there's quite a subtle debate about that, but certainly they should be extended where they can be extended far more widely. More investment in infrastructure. Hefty, GISC, all these people have a key role. Biz, we said, should do stuff too. I'm speeding up. In REF, we recommend that quantitative data should have a role, so REF panels should be able to access and use citation data if they want it, and that was the case in REF 14. Typically it was only the panels under A, the life sciences and stuff, that did use it a lot, but it should be made available, and we should keep training REF panel members in how to use quantitative data appropriately and sensibly, but that it should still be, as I say, supportive rather than the primary criteria that's being used to assess quality. Ditto on impact. We need to work on having guidelines for the use of some quantitative indicators, but we can't move fast in that direction, and this is reinforced by this very good study, if you haven't read it, that was done by King's and Digital Science on the 7,000 impact case studies that came out in March. Research environment is the one bit where you can do a bit more with data, but again I won't talk about that now. Final things, we said that the community needs to take this agenda forward. We proposed a forum for responsible metrics that would bring together all of these kind of players on the public funding side, but also some of the big publishers and providers and others to keep working on this agenda. And again, here the links and connections with the open access debate and the key players in that, in those debates are fairly clear. We've also, as a review group, set up a sort of legacy initiative. We've got a little blog and modelled on the Literary Review's Bad Sex in Fiction Award. We're going to, every year, hopefully following a very boozy lunch, award a bad metric prize to the most egregious example of inappropriate uses of quantitative indicators in the UK university system. So if you spot any in Sussex or elsewhere, let me know. Lots of discussion in the review. Times High did a big issue on it, etc., etc. I won't go through all of this. But just to end, and this picks up on something David said in his introduction, in one sense, the metrics review is one small specific set of questions about the use of metrics in the research system. But in another, it's part of a bigger evidence jigsaw that's been constructed ahead of the period we're now in, the last few weeks of the 2015 spending review, when the entire research community in the university system has been setting out its stall to BIS and to the Treasury and explaining why we think investment in research matters and why that investment needs to be maintained or ideally increased. And so it's important to sort of see it in that context. And of course, the other thing that's going on in this debate about metrics in the HE system is, in parallel to a discussion about the future of the REF, you've had now a huge amount of emphasis from government, from the new ministerial team in BIS, on the importance of an equivalent excellence framework for teaching, the TEF, and within that, an assumption that metrics should be used to measure various outcomes and dimensions of quality on the teaching side. And so one thing that we've been quite involved in recent weeks is a discussion with government about lessons from the research side of the system for the teaching side in terms of appropriate and inappropriate, responsible and irresponsible uses of metrics. And I'm sure that debate will continue to rage over the coming months when the Higher Education Green Paper surfaces in the next few weeks. We've also got a big push from government for so-called simplification of the research funding system, by which we take it from various ministerial comments. They want to reduce the number of funding bodies, and there's lots of discussion about this in the sector press, which many of you will be aware of. When I'm not doing things I should be doing here, run a science policy blog on The Guardian, and we leaked a couple of weeks ago an internal document from BIS, which is their future plan for BIS over the next 5 years, and it sort of sets out very clearly the sort of plan they have to cull funding bodies, all of which will have quite profound implications for the institutional landscape for research funding. It's quite possible that we see HEFKI disappear altogether. It's quite possible, indeed quite likely, I think, that we will see significant consolidation across the research councils. They will de facto operate as one body from some point next year, even though it will require primary legislation to formally wind some of them up. And I think the dual support system will be maintained, so we'll have money from the councils, money from QR, but the administration of QR is very likely to move across to the new super research council, whatever it's called. So lots of change ahead, and I think for those of us that care about open access, for those of us that care about responsible metrics, and all of these questions about open infrastructure, and more broadly about a healthy, vibrant, interdisciplinary, diverse research system, there's a lot at stake over the coming weeks and months for all of us in trying to make sure that whatever changes being proposed are implemented in a way that's as reduces harm, shall we say. So yeah, lots to say. I've been sort of out there batting for the REF. Not that I'm a great fan of the REF. I mean, we all hate running of the REF as a system, but it's a sort of least worst a bit like peer review. It's the sort of least worst thing that we've got, really. And to lose, if in losing the ref we lost QR money, I think many of us, particularly again in humanities and social sciences, would be deeply concerned about that. So anyway, that's sort of straying a bit off open access, but all of these things are linked. We've had a period over the last 5 years where, on the research side of the system, budgets have been flat, as we know, flat cash. In general, the university system has got through pretty unscathed, partly because of increased income from student fees. We've also had a big push towards open access in research, and so now we have to look ahead to the next 5 years and see how all of these things are going to play out, and whether there are going to be greater stresses and strains in the marriage or tension between these different agendas. So that's a few thoughts which I hope are helpful, and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James.